And here we go. We're starting our recording. Yes, hello everyone. My name is Stacy Nell. I'm the executive director of the Kansas African American Affairs Commission. And once again, I have a pre-recorded lunch and learn. So I'm not sure what that means for the chat or the how things may show up in the chat. But I am thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Anthony Lewis, who is the superintendent of the Lawrence Public School System. Hello, Dr. Lewis.
Hello, hello, Stacy. Thank you so much for having me on the Lunch and Learn today. Really excited to be here with you.
I know, and we were talking just a little bit before we started. This is the busy time of year for you, right?
Yes, we're winding down. We're here in May, middle of May, toward the end of school. We have about 4 or 5 days left of school, and we are beginning our graduations this week, and we'll finish them on next week. So busy time, but the most exciting time of the year for me. You know, there was a song, the most wonderful time of year. They were referencing Christmas, but for
Yeah.
me, the most wonderful time of year in education is seeing the students persevere and walk across the stage to get their high school diploma.
Okay. Well, that's good to know that the most wonderful time of year for you is May.
Yes, yes. We're probably a
Okay.
lot of
So
educators too.
yeah. So all right. So Dr. Lewis, just in case people don't know about you, we've got a little bit of a bio here that I'm going to read. Dr. Anthony Lewis began his career as a special education teacher in Montgomery, Alabama. After this, he was appointed to assistant principal and then became the award-winning principal of E.D. Nixon Elementary School. Because of his successes in Alabama, he was heavily recruited to work in the Kansas City, Missouri School District and became the assistant superintendent of school leadership for the KC Public Schools. Dr. Lewis has a BS in special education, a master's degree in special education, and a degree in educational leadership from Alabama State University. He received his PhD in educational leadership and policy analysis from the University of Missouri in Columbia in 2013. Currently, he is the superintendent of Lawrence Public Schools in Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence Public Schools is the seventh largest school district in the state, second largest employer in the city, and serves nearly 12,000 students in 21 schools. In November of 2019, Kansas Governor Laura Kelly appointed Dr. Lewis to the Kansas African American Affairs Commission. That's why, I'm like, hey, I know he exists.
All right.
And the commission devises strategies to address the public policy concerns of the African American community through partnerships with state agencies. In June of 2020, the governor also appointed Dr. Lewis to the Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. That's the CREJ. We'll talk about that later. The commission is tasked with studying issues of racial equity and justice in Kansas and began its work focusing on law enforcement community relations. Dr. Lewis is also the co-author of a book entitled It Was All a Dream. If you can dream it, you can make it happen. He's the co-founder of Turning Dreams into Realities, TDI Incorporated, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing scholarships and mentoring to youth, high school, and college students. So thank you, Dr. Anthony, for joining us. Of course, the first question I ask everybody, what are you having for lunch?
Well, today is special. I have a special lunch today because I get to share lunch with an elementary school student. This is a student that I've taken an interest in here in Lawrence. And so as part of a reward in terms of him being on his best behavior and making good decisions in school, I get the opportunity to take him Freddy's for lunch. So I'm having Freddy's along with my fourth grade student today.
Come on now.
Yeah.
Freddy's, man. So for them, maybe I could get you to get my children to be on their best behavior if it means you'll take them to lunch.
He's earned it. He's earned it. He tries hard every day.
Good.
Yes.
So you started your career as a special education teacher back in Alabama. So, I've asked several people, the 9-year-old Anthony, what made you, what drew you to the education, to teaching, and then what drew you specifically to getting into special education?
Wow. Interesting enough, you said the 9-year-old Anthony, because I was probably around maybe 9 or 10 when I began to spark an interest in the field of special education. And so I had a grandmother who was a cafeteria manager for Helen Keller School in Talladega, Alabama. And that was a school that, and still is a school that supports students with multiple disabilities, students that are both deaf and blind. And at the time they were calling it multiple handicaps, but multiple disabilities. And I also had a mother who was a teacher, a kindergarten teacher, and I had an aunt that was a special education, two aunts that were special education teachers. One just passed away about a week ago, as a matter of fact.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, and so they really exposed me, I would say. And so around the age of 9 or 10, I would go to the Helen Keller School during the summer and just observe, or I had to be taken there for summer care. And I noticed that many of the educators there focus more on the students' disabilities. And
Mm.
as a 9-year-old child, seeing a student that was either deaf or blind, or deaf and blind, still participate in sports and other activities, band, playing the drums, I became intrigued in terms of, wow, even though these students are housed at this residential school for their disabilities, they had some amazing abilities. And so I began to take an interest in what we were calling the underdogs, so to speak, or those that
Mhm.
uh, believed that they didn't belong in general education settings. And so I went to Alabama State University, so HBCU in Montgomery, Alabama, majored in special education, got a master's in special education, and began to teach at Jeff Davis High School in Montgomery, Alabama.
Wow. Okay. So how long did you teach? How long were you a teacher? And the whole time you were a special education teacher?
Yep, special education teacher for about 6 years. I did everything from resource teaching to working with students with autism there at Jeff Davis High School.
Fantastic. And then you made the transition to administration?
Yes, I had the idea or plan at that time to work at the State Department of Education, still in the area of special education.
Mhm.
We were able to do some things with our high school students there, and lobby the state to change some of their practices as it relates to awarding students with disabilities a high school diploma. In
Mhm.
Alabama, at that time, when you were enrolled in your high school career, you had to declare if you were going to complete these 4 years and receive a high school diploma, or a certificate, which was basically a certificate of attendance. And many students with disabilities were on track to get a certificate of attendance. Well, again, they had some amazing abilities, and so we were able to lobby the state and change some things. So I wanted to continue down that trajectory, but in order to do that, you had to have a degree in administration. And so I went on to get my degree in administration. Went
So
on.
wait, hang on. You got them to change the way that the people could graduate from high school?
Yes, so
That's fantastic.
we had a student that was on his track on the way to just get a certificate of attendance, but he had a disability in reading, a documented disability in reading, and with support and accommodations, he was able to master the grade level content. And so again, at that time in Alabama, that was something that we had to lobby the state to change. So they did change that, and I remember his name was George. He did graduate with a high school diploma, you know, and so
Wow.
again, I wanted to stay in that area of impacting change on a larger scale. But like I said, you had to have an admin degree. Got the admin degree, went on a mock interview, or yeah, a screener interview rather, so I can prepare for my state job. But the screener interviews were for principals in Montgomery, or assistant principals in Montgomery. And again, I just wanted to practice for my state job, and let me go do your little screener interview. Needless to say, a principal called me and asked me if I would come in for an interview at an elementary school, and it was E.D. Nixon Elementary School. And needless to say, I did accept that position as assistant principal there, and
That's
became
funny.
principal.
I mean, a lot of people I've talked to, they talk about how we often think our lives are going to go one direction, and then we make just one decision, and that puts our lives going in a completely different direction.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So I had no plans on being a principal superintendent. I really wanted to stay in the field of special education at the state level.
Wow. Okay. So, but eventually you did become a principal, and eventually you made your way to KC
That's
Kansas
correct.
City, Missouri Public Schools. And
Yes.
if you want to talk briefly about your time there, because I mean, I'd like to get to your time here in Lawrence, in
Okay.
Kansas, but
Yeah, yeah. So was assistant principal at E.D. Nixon, and then principal of E.D. Nixon, and it became when we first got there, it was like the lowest school in the state, lowest performing school in the state, on the brink of state takeover. And because of some dedicated teachers that had this unwavering belief that students from high poverty areas still can learn, um, we were able to turn that school around. It became number 18 out of 706 schools in the state of Alabama. And so then I was recruited to work in Kansas City public schools, Kansas City on the Missouri side. So moved my family, my wife, and at that time 5 kids to Missouri. Again, didn't know anything about Kansas City other than the Royals and the Chiefs, who both were not good at that time. This was around 2000.
yeah, I mean, we had a couple
Yeah, yeah. So
slow decades.
right. So I didn't know much about Kansas City. Started doing my research on Kansas City public schools, and if anyone out there can recall, around 2011 time, just about every story on Kansas City public schools was a negative story.
Yeah.
And I remember reading this comment from someone that said, "I wouldn't send my dog to that school district."
Ooh.
And so again, me always wanting to prove people wrong about what they believe kids can and cannot do. Went to Kansas City. There, 1 year as a principal, then director of elementary schools, and then assistant superintendent. And now I'm in Lawrence Public Schools.
All right. And so you've been in Lawrence since 2018.
Yes.
Yeah. And you could, hey, toot your horn, but I know I was going to ask about the fact that but you were in Lawrence in 2018, which meant that you were in Lawrence in 2020
Yes.
when COVID happened.
Exactly.
And everyone was impacted by COVID. There was no aspect of our lives that wasn't touched by the pandemic, including the schools.
Yes.
So I imagine, or actually, I don't know. That's why I'm asking. So what was it like being superintendent of Lawrence is not a small district, 12,000 students. How did you navigate that closing of the schools? I know there was questions about children going hungry or children not having eyes on them, or just what was that experience like?
Yeah. So as you read my bio, you did not say anything about I got a degree in a pandemic or COVID because no one expected that. You did state that I received my PhD, was a doctor, but not a medical doctor or pandemic related doctor. And so that took everyone by surprise in terms of the educational field. And we had to quickly navigate and shift the way that we were providing instruction. And so when we first learned of COVID, when we first learned of the one case in Kansas at that time, and then in Douglas County, we began to engage our health professionals, those that were experts in that area. We were so fortunate in Lawrence to have our Douglas County Health Department, our KU pandemic medical team that we constantly met with. We met with a group of other superintendents here in Douglas County, the chancellor of KU, Haskell Indian Station University. And so we met frequently as a unified command to really talk about how we would navigate this
Right.
as a community. And I'm pleased to say that we had some of the lowest rates here in Douglas County in the state because of the measures that we took. At that time when the governor ordered all schools to close, we had to figure out a way that we would still provide education in the homes. We were fortunate to already be a one-to-one district where every student had a device. Our K-5 students had iPads. Our K-8 students had iPads, and our 9-12 students had MacBooks. But still, we had to figure out a way to deliver that instruction into their home. So it was a challenging time for this community, just navigating the uncertainty, the unknowns, and how everything seemed like it changed every single day. So it was.
Did you sleep well? Did you get some? Were you drinking enough water?
Well,
I'm concerned about people who had to really be in the trenches, because at that time I was at home, like everyone else was at home.
Yeah.
But to have to, lead a school district through that such a hard time.
No, and I didn't sleep well because many of our families depend on school for other things other than just the academics, but for food, and that sense of safety. And so when those students didn't have that consistent space for them to come every single day, we began to mobilize and take food out into the community. We began door to door. And then, we had a group of restaurants who were closed at that time, but still needed to pay their employees. We began to work with them to establish pickup sites for families to come to. And so they were able to still employ their workers, and we were able to get food into families' hands.
See, and it's kind of sad because stuff like that doesn't make the news, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? So, the fact that you partnered with local restaurants to keep the restaurants open so they could pay their workers, to get food so you could feed the students, that's not the kind of stuff that makes the news. The stuff that makes the news is schools are horrible and teachers are horrible. I'm like, no, they're not. So,
But that was beautiful to see this community really come together, and they met our needs in terms of finding or getting food into the hands of our families. And we were able to support them in terms of getting their workers paid. So it was really beautiful to see the community come together.
That's a great story. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, and then I wanted to move on because so 2020 was COVID.
Mhm.
I remember during 2020, I said the world turned upside down twice. COVID was the first time the world turned upside down. And then in the middle of COVID, the George Floyd incident happened. Actually, a lot happened. There was Ahmaud Arbery. There was a lot. 2020 was a lot.
Mhm.
But the governor convened the Special Commission on Racial Equity and Justice, the CREJ, and she appointed you to that commission. So, can you tell us about how that went? I mean, one, how that went. I'll just leave it as an
Yeah,
open of a question as possible.
right. Yeah. So first of all, I definitely appreciate Governor Kelly's swift action to assemble this commission to look at, yeah, as you mentioned, it was on the result of George Floyd, to really look at policing in the state of Kansas. And so there was a really diverse group of individuals on the commission from around the state, led by Dr. Um, gosh,
Tiffany Anderson.
yeah, thank you, Tiffany Anderson. You didn't see this because she's a good friend of mine, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to. I hope to get her on the show as well. I'm trying
Yeah,
to I'm like, who are all the black superintendents? So let me go. Okay, so
yeah. I had an opportunity to work with her in Kansas City, and then obviously we're colleagues here, as she's superintendent there in Topeka. But Dr. Tiffany Anderson and Shannon Portillo, they led this commission. And so what it was like was we did a lot of listening. We invited some outside agencies in. We really looked at police training, and so we were able to learn how and what some of the modules of training that they go through. So the first part of it was really just listening and learning from different organizations. And then as we were listening and learning, we began to develop our recommendations for state agencies, for local agencies, and for legislator, to really look at the state of policing, but also some recommendations as it relates to training. We looked at and heard from some police stop data. What do
Mhm.
police look at, when they're stopping cars? Does the bias begin there? And because we learned that most of police brutality or unfortunate police killings begins with just a police traffic stop.
So some of the recommendations, like from recommendations that you remember, are there any that got implemented that you're glad got implemented? Are there any that weren't or have not yet been implemented that you're like, hey, this could really be helpful?
Yeah, yeah. So really looking at diversifying the trainers was one area that we looked at that I do believe got implemented. Looking at and increasing mental health aid training to some police officers, increasing the bias-based police training, in addition to just the bare minimum that they receive from CPOS. Those were a few that I believe got implemented, but we did still have some that we're still pushing to get implemented. So every time I interact here locally, or sometimes when we had a new police chief, I shared those recommendations with him here locally.
Hmm. And I will. I'll put in the either in the since this is
Mhm.
pre-recorded. It's not going out live, so I'm not putting information like in the chat as it goes. But it'll go out on YouTube. It'll be in the description box, and it'll be in show notes somehow. I can link to the reports. I know people knew that this commission was up and running.
Mhm.
Even when I first got this job, people were aware of the CREJ, but I'm not sure everyone was aware of the reports that were produced. So
Right.
I will have in the description or in the show notes or something links to the reports, because there have been two, right? The first one was on policing and the second one was on education.
Social determinants of health,
Okay,
which
social
includes
determinants of
race.
health.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And so as individuals begin to engage with those documents, you will see that there'll be recommendations by state agency, by legislature, and by local. And so as you're advocating with your legislators, please pay close attention to that legislative session. As you're advocating locally, whether it's where you look at the social determinants of health or you're looking at the law enforcement report, it has ways that you can advocate locally, and then also on the state level.
Hmm. So I'll put those links, yeah, because they're fairly extensive. I
Mhm.
think they're both at least like 90 pages. Like they're very comprehensive.
Yeah, they are um, extensive reports, which that was backed by research and supported by research. And then when we looked at the social determinants of health, we looked at early childhood care, tax policy, and you mentioned education. We looked at teacher diversity, school resource officers,
Mhm.
which was a hot topic around that time. Still is a hot topic in many areas. School mascots. How are we harming our native students by continuing to have harmful mascots, and then maternity, childcare health, and vaccine equity.
So yeah, these are all issues. If a person's watching this and they have any kind of interest in this information, it's a deep dive. It's a pretty comprehensive report.
Yeah.
And then, yes, you are on the African American Affairs Commission, which is the commission that I'm also on. And if people have been watching our Lunch and Learns, you will notice that I'm going to start slowly working my way through all the commissioners. I had Dr. New on. One of my first guests was our current chair, Mark McCormick. So I'm slowly going to start to try to spend some time with all the commissioners so that people know who you guys are. Because, Dr. Lewis, say it with me. What's my goal? Raise the profile of the commission.
Raise the profile of the commissioners.
And that's been my mantra ever since I got this job. So, and I personally do want to thank you for the work that you've done for the commission. I know, well, maybe people don't know, because in 2021, when we had our Martin Luther King program, I decided at the end of 2020, I'm like, okay, we need to have this virtually, because we weren't sure what COVID was doing. We weren't sure what was going on with anything, vaccines, anything. Was there going to be a spike? We had to close down again. So you actually rescued us, and you were our keynote speaker. You did an excellent job.
Thank you.
I was like, people told me you were going to be fantastic. I was like, no, he was beyond fantastic.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think because I don't know, your roots in Alabama, like you almost seem like you intrinsically knew stuff that I had never even heard before.
Yeah. As you mentioned, when I was in Montgomery, the cradle of civil rights movement, I was the principal of E.D. Nixon Elementary School, and those that are familiar with that was Edgar Daniel Nixon. He was very instrumental in the Montgomery Improvement Association and the NAACP there in Montgomery. He was the one that actually bailed Rosa Parks out of jail. So he was one of those unsung heroes in the civil rights movement. And so as a result, our students learned heavily about him. And Rosa Parks' home was maybe a few blocks from the school in West Montgomery. So a lot of rich history there. And so I was pleased to have the opportunity to share at the ML King program.
I mean, I'm not trying to get either one of us in trouble, but when you bring up this idea that, well, people in that place in Alabama would know who E.D. Hicks is, but maybe people who were I was raised in Iowa.
Okay.
Right? So just me going to school in Iowa, unlike, like you said, if a child at that school at some point might go, who is E.D. Hicks? And so the teachers would teach it. But a person in Waterloo, Iowa, who would never have any need to know that, like we may hear about Rosa, well, everyone hears about Rosa right. Martin, and Harriet Tubman, but to know more history. I mean, so as a superintendent of a school, what are your thoughts on things like that? How about that for a loaded question?
Yeah, no,
get us both in trouble.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think it's important that we teach accurate history in all schools, and we don't take pages out of history for fear of how it may make someone feel. Think about how it makes, and I use this example sometimes with some standards in some states. It was like this in Kansas, but the State Department has revised their social studies standards. At one point, it was like that in Missouri too. If I'm a Black student, the first time I may see myself in a curriculum or a textbook, I'm in shackles and in chains. And that's normally, that typically would take place around 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade. And then around 6th grade, I learned about ancient Egypt when we were kings and queens. So first of all, that's not even chronologically in order.
Right.
So when you think about, as a Black student, if I'm seeing myself in chains, or my ancestors in chains, what does that do to my self-worth? How do I feel showing up every day if I'm in a classroom and I have some white students that are looking at those pictures and looking at me? How do you think I feel? And so when we think about some of the rhetoric around not teaching parts of history, or the schools are teaching critical race theory, I appreciate our board and our community here for allowing us to do that, to teach all of history, because we want all of our students to feel valued, but also to understand what happened in the past, whether it was dark, so we won't repeat it. And if you can see by some of the things that are happening around the country, it's almost like we're repeating history in some instances, in terms of how some students of color may feel in school.
Right. And I want to give you a chance to clarify something you just said. You don't teach critical race theory and the yeah, okay, because you said it's like you said mention critical race theory, then you said to have freedom to give our teachers to do that, and I was like, I just know that some people listening to this are going to go, hey, what did he just say?
No, we
So
do not teach critical race theory. We have never taught critical race theory.
right.
And I think a lot of people have a misconception or don't really understand what critical race theory is. In addition, they are tagging just about everything on to critical race theory, from social emotional learning. Oh, we can't teach that. To let me see the surveys that you're administering to all children. Let me see your curriculum, so we can make sure that you're not teaching. Let me see who's coming in to train about diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are some school districts around the country and really around the state that can't even say the words like diversity or equity. But we can do that here in Lawrence. That's one of the reasons that I'm really proud to serve as superintendent here in Lawrence Public Schools.
All right. Well, fantastic. Lastly, I wanted to touch on, because in reading your bio, I did mention this Turning Dreams into Realities.
Mhm.
And it's an organization, and again, you can just tell us what you want about it. I know it's based in Alabama, and it's a mentoring, providing scholarships, mentoring, and professional developments to students there. So what can you tell us about that organization?
Yeah, so during my time at Alabama State University, became friends with 13 other Black males there. And at the time, we didn't think nothing of it. But now, when you look back on it, all of us came from single parent homes.
Mm.
But yet, and still, we all graduated with not only bachelors, masters. We have CPAs, presidents of Fortune 500 companies, superintendents, and some other college provosts. And so what we wanted to do was kind of give back in form of scholarship. So the first thing we did was we wrote a book. It was all a dream. And so around that, and that came from around the time we were in school, around the 90s, the true hip hop era. Notorious Biggs had the song "It Was All a Dream," and so we took that song, and each chapter is kind of like the title of the chapter is maybe from a verse of that song. And so we just kind of told our stories, how we overcame obstacles, dispelling the data around if you're a Black male, come from a single parent home, your chances of graduating high school or you're going on to college are slim, but we divide the odds. And so what we wanted to do, write the book. All proceeds from the book goes to the scholarships. We also donate our personal funds to scholarships. And so we wanted to do more than just give money. Anybody can write a check, which is good. But the longer we also wanted to address the retention rates, particularly at HBCUs. And so we wanted the longer you stay in college, the more money you can get. And so in addition to that, we provided mentoring there as well. And so we go back home often, those that can, to mentor these young students and just wrap our arms around them and make sure that they get across the stage.
That is so important. And you mentioned the idea that you realized that you had this in common with all the other men in this group, and then you said you wrote the book to tell your own stories. This is something that's come up time and time again in the people that I've interviewed for this Lunch and Learn series. This idea of you can't be what you don't see.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And so providing that tangible example to people who are coming behind us, like, yes, you can graduate. Not only can you just graduate, but you can go to college. Not only can you just graduate from college, you can get advanced degrees, you can get high-powered jobs, you can work in the government, you can really be a changer in the field. Because I know there are a lot of people that I watched and continue to watch, like even as an adult, right? Like I remember the first time I laid eyes on Dr. D'Angelo Burns Wallace, I was like, who is this person?
Yes. Yeah.
And so, I think it's important for that. So I personally thank you on behalf of all the little Black boys who are going to read your book and go, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I can do that. Despite the obstacles and the variables that I show up with every single day, I still can be successful. And so that's what we wanted to do with that book, and what we want to continue to do with our mentoring program.
Fantastic. So we talked about all the things that you have been doing, but you're still a young man. You got life ahead of you. What are some of your plans or hopes for the future for Lawrence schools or for yourself?
Well, specifically for Lawrence schools, these have been some challenging past few years, not only with COVID, but we've been dealing with some budget cuts as well. And so my hopes and plans for the future is to stay here and to continue to put us on a path for fiscal health.
Mhm.
That's one. And doing that, as well as addressing our academics and our graduation rates. And so even in the midst of COVID and these budget cuts, our graduation rates are the highest that they've been in 16 years. We're closing the gaps there between some of our subgroups as it relates to our graduation rates. We're seeing, slight increases on our academics, and so our goal here is to be the best school district in the state of Kansas. And so that's my hope, is to make sure that we're providing the adequate supports for all students, making sure that we are providing the adequate supports for our teachers, making sure that we are adequately paying our teachers and all of our staff, our classified staff, as well. That's something that we have to do now more than ever. We have some amazingly talented teachers and staff members in this district. We need to make sure that we're valuing them, make sure that we are not overloading them with work, and making sure that we are creating environments that they look forward to coming to work. They've been through a lot these past few years, and we have to make sure we're doing right by them, because they're the ones that's taking care of our students in the buildings.
Right. Definitely. See, and I thought just like 5 more questions to ask about the teacher shortage and retention and all that stuff, but we are actually at a half an hour.
Okay.
So I guess I'm going to have to maybe have you come back in a couple months so I can ask you about all those other questions.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lewis, for coming on. Every time I end, I want to talk a little bit about voting. It's so important that I'm not just talking about voting when there's an election 6 weeks out, right? Just continually talking about voting, especially with our people. We are always underrepresented when it comes to turnout numbers. We're always underrepresented when it comes to registrations. And y'all, politicians, pay attention to the people who pay attention to them. So we as a community need to start paying attention and being active. So yes, go out and read the CREJ reports, contact your, and because it talks about, it's not just your state legislatures, it talks about local. So there are local things you can do, because I'm sympathetic to the notion that dealing with Topeka sometimes can feel crazy. So.
Yeah, in those reports, there's things that they can advocate at the city council, at their city council meeting, county commission meetings, their local school boards, in terms of how they are utilizing their SROs in their buildings, or mascots, or teacher diversity. So it's a lot of information for everybody. So you have a part. You can find something in those documents that you can advocate for, and go vote at the local elections as well as the national.
Oh my gosh, the local elections.
So important.
Yes. So there you go. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lewis. It has been a pleasure to talk to you in this formalized. I've talked to you for years, but this has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All right. Bye, everybody. I will see you next Monday.